Here's Hebraic Tidbits in 5 minutes with your host, Rabbi Pastor LaRue.
Shalom, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Hebraic Tidbits in 10 minutes. Okay, so today's tidbit is a two-part teaching. So please be sure to catch this amazing part 2 episode, which is going to be filled with plenty of insights and revelation like you've never heard before. Okay, so now today's tidbit is found in, we're going to be diving into the book in the Gospel of Yohanan, who we call John, and this is John 7:53, 8:1 to 11. Okay, and in this chapter, Yeshua Jesus had just left the temple area, which was in Jerusalem, where there was a huge commotion there over Jesus or Yeshua being the prophet like Moses, or even being the promised Messiah of Israel. It was a big commotion. The Pharisees and Sadducees were totally upset over this situation in Jerusalem. And the Jewish leadership was furious over this, and they wanted to have him arrested and brought to them. But the temple guards, they refused to arrest him here. So after all of this, Yeshua headed to the Mount of Olives to spend the night. So here he is. He spends the night in the Mount of Olives, and the next morning he returns to the temple and encounters the scribes and Pharisees who were only there looking to entrap and accuse Yeshua Jesus, of course, for doing something wrong, so that what? Well, so that they might discredit him from making more claims to being the Jewish Messiah. So that was the beef and the argument with the Pharisees and Sadducees. They are now looking for a time to entrap him and accuse him and discredit his claims about him making himself out to be the Jewish Messiah. So what do they do next? Well, they now bring a woman to him who was supposedly caught in the act of adultery here in this story. And this is how the story all begins to unfold for us, where, again, in John 7:53, 8:1 through 11. And this is what it says, starting with verse 53 here. Then each went on his own to his own home, but Yeshua Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him. And he sat down, and he taught him. Verse 3. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in his midst, verse 4, they said to him, Teacher, or that was Rabbi, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Verse 5, now Moses in the law, or that is the Torah, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? Verse 6. This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to what? Well, to accuse him of. But Yeshua, or Jesus, stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear them. Verse 7. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone at her. Verse 8. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Verse 9. Then those who heard it, being convicted of their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Verse 10, when Yeshua, when Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? Verse 11, she said, No one, Lord. And Yeshua said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Now, there's a couple of problems and some issues about this event in the life of Yeshua, or Jesus, that most people really don't know about. Now, the first issue begins with, again, going back to the Greek translation. According to some Bible translations and scholars out there, the main reason as to why some Bibles bracket or remove John 7:53 and 8:11 is because they believe, okay, this is what the scholars and the interpreters believe, that this was merely a scribe's liturgical story. Now, did you hear that? Okay? What they're saying is that this portion of Scripture on the life of the Messiah was added to the Gospel of John. They further believe that the story in the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both generally dating back to the 4th century, do not include this section either. So these older Greek manuscripts, they didn't contain this part of the story of John in the Gospel. And even further, another Greek manuscript called the Papyrus, which are among the oldest extant fragments of John's Gospel, also lack this portion of John 7:53 and chapter 8, verses 11. So they're telling us that the oldest Greek manuscripts here, according to the scholars, are trying to tell us that these things weren't included, again, in the gospel writings. This actually came in a lot later, and it was added to the gospel. So, what our question and contention here is, did this even ever truly happen in the life of the Messiah? Or was it added after the canonization of the New Covenant? Canonization, okay, is when they compiled all the Gospels together and they made it a final official document for us, which we call is the New Testament. Okay, so it was added. Was it added after the canonization of the New Covenant? And should any of this even matter? I mean, should we even worry about any of this? Well, actually, scholars today are divided here on the issue. But what we really need to understand and get a hold of here is that this portion of Scripture, as other scholars are saying, and there are other scholars that say that this was actually a true event in the life of the Messiah, okay? But this portion of Scripture in the life of the Messiah was only used among the church clergy and was used as a liturgical church reading during the season of Pentecost. Now, this is the idea here. This is what we have heard from the scholars. They think that this was a liturgical story only used during the season of Pentecost, way back before the New Testament was compiled. Others contend that John 7:53 through 8:11 was handed down orally but was never included in the canonization, but had been used again in the liturgical reading. So what they're telling us is that this was handed down orally, okay? Each clergyman or each priest or whatever minister, it was handed down to him and handed down to him and handed down to him, but it was never included because it was only used for a liturgical reading during the Feast of Pentecost in the early church. And this was never included in the canonization. It crept in much time later. So that's why some scholars are doubtful whether as to this really happened in the life of Yeshua. But what's our thought on this? Well, I'm going to tell you that in just one moment. So regardless of the ongoing debates here about whether this portion was or wasn't included in the older Greek manuscripts, is still up for debate today. Okay? So, how should we approach this information? While the information is debatable, okay, it is debatable, we can conclude that the story was, again, at some point, a part of the Messiah's life. It just wasn't included in the canonization process. So, here's my opinion here on this whole thing. My opinion and belief here is that this event This did happen, and again, that the story wasn't added once more until a later time when the Gospels were compiled. Previous of its regardless of its use, we believe this really actually happened in the life of the Messiah. Okay, that's our opinion on the story. We're going to stick with that. So now, finally getting into the meat, and the bones here of the story, we find a second problem here. So our first problem is we're questioning whether this was ever a part of the Lord's life. We believe it was. We can move on to the next issue. And this is the second problem that we examine here with John 7:53 to John 8:11. 11. And the first thing that we're going to notice here is that the woman who is accused of adultery here in the reading is full of holes. There's lots of holes in this story. There's lots of things wrong going on here. And let me tell you why. First of all, we learn here that the two men brought her to the Messiah had openly accused her of adultery, as seen from verse 4 of John 8. So they bring her to him. There's a problem with the way that they bring her to him. Now get this, okay? They themselves had already known perfectly what the law of Moses had to say about adultery, okay? In fact, here's their big mistake. Here's the thing that they did wrong. Here's where they make a huge mistake and create a big sin and violate the law of Moses here, which we call is the Torah. Okay, so you see, the law or the Torah of Moses required that the two who committed the act of adultery, both, okay, get this, both had to be present for questioning and possible sentencing. So you couldn't just bring one person and say, oh, they were accused of this crime. Well, where's your witness? You had to have, and especially if it came down to adultery, you had to have both people. We'll explain more of that in just a second. So the law of Moses required that two people that were caught in the act of adultery both need to be present for questioning and possible sentencing. You see, according to the law of Moshe or Moses, people were not allowed to commit vigilantism, which is to take the law into their own hands, as the Torah said in Devarim, and this is Deuteronomy 25:1. This is what it says. It says, if there is a dispute, okay, if there is a dispute between men, they are to go to court to be judged, so that the innocent may be acquitted and the guilty may be condemned. But as we can see here in the account, both the Pharisees and the scribes did exactly this, along with breaking the 9th commandment, which is what? Well, it's bearing false witness, also found again in the Torah. So here's their second mistake that they make in violating the Mosaic law. This is found in Shemot, which we call Exodus 20, verse 16, which says, verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So far we see two accounts where the Pharisees deliberately violate the law of Moses. The first one is they bring this woman without the other party present to sentence her correctly. Secondly, they take her outside of the court, and they're supposed to be brought to the court so that the judges may judge and not just anyone take it into their own hands. We'll explain more of that in just a minute. Okay, so the next thing is that they bared false witness. This woman was innocent, and we're going to find out why in just a little bit as well. But here we go. We've got three errors made on behalf of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They violate the Mosaic law, so they are the ones already in guilt right here at this point. So what next? Well, now we return we'll return to this in part 2 in this episode. We'll begin with digging even deeper into this issue and get into these fascinating facts in this story, okay? So right here we're going to pause, and we're going to begin to get into our part 2 story, and we'll be right back after this.
Be sure and join us and watch part 2 of this exciting video filled with helpful insights and revelation like you've never heard before, with Rabbi Pastor LaRue. You've been watching Hebraic Tidbits in 10 minutes.